The snow fell like tiny white bullets across the barren landscape of northern Afghanistan. It was December 24th, 2019, and Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez had been staring at the same radio for 3 hours, waiting for a response that would never come. His breath formed small clouds in the freezing air as he pressed the transmit button one more time. "Command, this is Alpha Team. We have 11 wounded SEALs requesting immediate extraction. Weather conditions are deteriorating rapidly. We need evac now, over." Static filled the air. Nothing but the endless hiss of empty radio waves and the distant howl of wind through the Rocky Mountains. Marcus looked down at his watch. It had been 6 hours since the ambush that had torn his team apart, and still no word from headquarters. The mission had started like any other. Intelligence reports suggested a high-value target was hiding in a compound deep in the Khyber province. 12 Navy SEALs had been inserted under cover of darkness, their helicopter disappearing into the night sky like a ghost. What they found waiting for them was not a single terrorist leader, but an entire network of fighters who had been expecting them. The firefight had been brutal and swift. Within minutes, 11 of the 12 team members were down with various injuries ranging from bullet wounds to shrapnel damage from improvised explosive devices. Only Marcus, a combat medic attached to the SEAL team, remained mobile and able to fight. He had dragged his wounded teammates one by one into a small cave system they had discovered during their retreat. The natural shelter provided some protection from both the enemy fire and the worsening weather conditions, but it was far from ideal. The cave was cold, damp, and barely large enough to accommodate all 12 men. Lieutenant Commander James Sullivan, the team leader, lay propped against the cave wall with a bullet wound in his shoulder and another in his leg. Despite his injuries, his eyes remained sharp and focused as he tried to maintain command of the deteriorating situation. "Rodriguez," Sullivan called out weakly, his voice echoing slightly in the confined space. "What's the latest from command?" Marcus shook his head grimly. "Nothing, sir. Radio silence for the past hour. I've been trying every frequency we have." The other wounded SEALs listened intently, though most were too badly hurt to contribute much to the conversation. Petty Officer First Class David Chen sat with his back against the cave wall, applying pressure to a deep gash across his abdomen. His face was pale, but his hands remained steady as he worked to control the bleeding. "They know where we are," Chen said quietly. "The GPS beacon is still active. They have to know." Marcus checked his equipment for what felt like the 100th time. The GPS beacon was indeed functioning properly, sending their exact coordinates back to headquarters every 30 seconds. There was no technical reason why command should not know their location and condition. Petty Officer Second Class Michael Thompson, despite having taken shrapnel to both legs, managed to maintain his sense of humor. "Maybe they're all at the Christmas party," he said with a weak smile. "You know how brass loves their holiday celebrations." Several of the other SEALs managed weak chuckles, but the joke felt hollow in the current circumstances. They all knew that military operations did not stop for holidays, and their situation was far too serious for command to simply ignore. As the hours passed, Marcus moved between his wounded teammates, checking vitals, changing bandages, and administering what medical care he could with their limited supplies. He had managed to stabilize most of the serious injuries, but several of the men needed immediate surgical attention that he could not provide in their current environment. Petty Officer Third Class Robert Martinez had suffered a severe head injury when an explosion had thrown him against a rock wall. Though conscious, he showed signs of possible traumatic brain injury. His responses to questions were slow, and Marcus had noticed his pupils were not responding properly to light. "Rodriguez," Martinez said softly during one of Marcus's medical checks. "My head feels strange. Everything seems far away." Marcus nodded and made notes in his mental medical log. Martinez needed a neurosurgeon, not a field medic with basic supplies. The longer they remained in the cave, the worse his condition would likely become. Chief Petty Officer William Parker, the team's demolitions expert, had suffered burns to his hands and arms when an explosive device had detonated closer than expected. The burns were second degree across most of the affected area, and Marcus had used a significant portion of their medical supplies treating them. "I can still fight," Parker insisted every time Marcus checked on him, though they all knew that his hands were in no condition to handle weapons or explosives effectively. The youngest member of their team, Seaman Jake Williams, had been hit in the chest by rifle fire. Marcus had managed to seal the wound and prevent a collapsed lung, but Williams needed immediate surgery to remove bullet fragments that were dangerously close to his heart. Williams was only 22 years old, fresh out of SEAL training, and this had been his first major combat deployment. He kept asking about his girlfriend back home, wondering if she would receive notification of his injury status. "She's going to be so worried," Williams whispered during one of his more lucid moments. "I promised her I'd call on Christmas morning." Marcus tried to reassure him while privately worrying about whether any of them would make it to Christmas morning. The weather outside continued to worsen, and their radio remained stubbornly silent. Petty Officer First Class Anthony Rodriguez, no relation to Marcus despite the shared surname, had suffered a broken leg when he had fallen into a hidden pit during their retreat. Marcus had managed to set the bone and create a makeshift splint, but Anthony would not be walking without assistance anytime soon. "This is not how I plan to spend Christmas Eve," Anthony said, attempting to maintain morale despite his obvious pain. The team's communications specialist, Petty Officer Second Class Brian Foster, had taken shrapnel to his right arm, rendering it largely useless. What made his injury particularly concerning was that he was left-handed, which meant he could still operate radio equipment if necessary. "Let me try the radio," Foster offered during one of Marcus's unsuccessful attempts to reach command. "Maybe I can boost the signal somehow." Foster worked with the radio equipment for nearly an hour, adjusting frequencies and trying different antenna configurations. His efforts produced nothing but the same static that had been their only companion for hours. Petty Officer Third Class Samuel Lewis had suffered internal injuries that Marcus suspected involved damage to his kidneys or liver. Lewis was experiencing severe abdominal pain and had been urinating small amounts of blood, both signs that concerned Marcus greatly. "I feel like I've been hit by a truck," Lewis said weakly. "Everything inside hurts." Marcus had given Lewis what pain medication they carried, but their supplies were limited, and he needed to conserve what remained for the other wounded men. The most seriously injured was Petty Officer First Class Jason Murphy, who had been closest to the largest explosion during the ambush. Murphy had suffered multiple trauma injuries, including a punctured lung, severe lacerations, and possible internal bleeding. Marcus had managed to treat the punctured lung with a chest tube improvised from their limited supplies, but Murphy's condition remained critical. His breathing was labored, and Marcus could see that he was growing weaker with each passing hour. "Rodriguez," Murphy whispered during one medical check, his voice barely audible. "If we don't make it out of here, don't talk like that." Marcus interrupted firmly. "We're all getting out of here. Command will send extraction." But as Marcus said the words, he felt less certain of their truth with each passing moment. 6 hours was too long for radio silence during an active mission with wounded personnel. Something was seriously wrong. The cave provided shelter from the wind and snow, but it offered no protection from the dropping temperature. Marcus had distributed their emergency blankets among the wounded, but hypothermia was becoming an increasingly serious concern as the night wore on. Marcus himself was exhausted, but refused to rest. As the only uninjured member of the team, he felt responsible for keeping everyone alive until help arrived. He moved continuously between his teammates, checking on their conditions, adjusting their positions to keep them comfortable, and monitoring their vital signs. The weight of responsibility pressed down on him like a physical force. These were not just fellow soldiers. They were men he had trained with, fought beside, and considered family. Each one had a story, a life waiting for them back home, people who loved them and were counting on their safe return. Lieutenant Commander Sullivan had 2 young daughters who would be waiting for their father to come home for Christmas. Chen had recently gotten engaged and was planning a spring wedding. Thompson had just bought his first house and was excited about starting a family with his wife of 3 years. As Marcus looked around the cave at his wounded teammates, he made a silent promise. No matter what had happened with command, no matter why their calls for help were being ignored, he would not abandon these men. He would stay with them and fight for them until help arrived or until there was no fight left in him. Outside, the wind continued to howl through the mountains, and the snow fell heavier with each passing hour. Inside the cave, 11 wounded Navy SEALs waited for rescue that seemed increasingly unlikely to come, while one determined combat medic prepared to make the most important decision of his military career. The radio crackled with static once more, and Marcus reached for it with hope that was becoming harder to maintain. But as his hand touched the transmit button, he already knew what he would hear. Nothing but the endless silence that had become their unwanted companion on this cold Christmas Eve in the mountains of Afghanistan. Time seemed to move differently in the cave. Minutes felt like hours, and hours stretched into what felt like days. Marcus continued his medical rounds, but he could see that some of his teammates were losing hope. The reality of their situation was beginning to sink in for everyone. "Maybe they can't get to us because of the weather," suggested Foster, though his voice lacked conviction. Marcus nodded, though privately he doubted that weather alone would prevent command from attempting some form of rescue or at least maintaining radio contact. Military operations had protocols for exactly these types of situations, and those protocols did not include complete communication blackouts. As the night progressed, Marcus found himself facing an impossible choice. He could continue waiting for orders that might never come, or he could take matters into his own hands and attempt to save his teammates through his own actions. The decision would define not only his military career, but also his ability to live with himself for the rest of his life. The question that haunted him was simple but devastating. How far would he be willing to go to save the men who had become his brothers? And what would he do if command had truly abandoned them to die in this frozen cave on Christmas Eve? 8 hours had passed since the ambush, and Marcus Rodriguez was beginning to understand that they were truly on their own. The temperature had dropped another 10 degrees, and frost was forming on the cave walls despite the body heat from 12 men packed into the small space. The wounded SEALs were growing weaker, and Marcus knew that time was running out. He tried the radio one more time, switching to an emergency frequency that should have been monitored around the clock. Any station, this is Alpha Team with 11 wounded requiring immediate medical evacuation. We're taking heavy casualties due to exposure and lack of medical care. Please respond. The response came not as words, but as something far worse than silence. A brief burst of static was followed by what sounded like someone deliberately cutting the transmission. Marcus felt his blood run cold as he realized that command was not just ignoring them. They were actively blocking their communications. Lieutenant Commander Sullivan noticed the change in Marcus's expression immediately. Despite his injuries, Sullivan's leadership instincts remained sharp. "What is it, Rodriguez? What did you hear?" Marcus hesitated before answering. The truth would destroy what little morale remained among the wounded men, but lying to his commanding officer felt equally wrong. "Sir, I think our communications are being jammed. Someone doesn't want us talking to headquarters." The implications of this statement hung heavy in the cold air. If their communications were being jammed, it meant that someone with significant authority had made a deliberate decision to cut them off. The question was why. Sullivan's face darkened as he processed this information. As a lieutenant commander with over 15 years of service, he had seen enough military politics to understand that sometimes operations were sacrificed for larger strategic goals. But abandoning an entire SEAL team seemed extreme even by those standards. "Sir," Marcus continued quietly, "I've been thinking about our mission brief. The intelligence seemed too good to be true. A high-value target just sitting in a compound with minimal security, and the timing, inserting us on Christmas Eve when most of the command structure would be operating with skeleton crews." Sullivan nodded slowly, the pieces beginning to fall into place. "You think we were set up?" "I think someone wanted us to walk into that ambush," Marcus replied. "And now they're making sure we can't tell anyone about it." The conversation was interrupted by a groan from Petty Officer Murphy, whose condition had worsened significantly over the past hour. Marcus quickly moved to his side, checking his pulse and breathing. Murphy's skin had taken on a gray pallor, and his breathing was becoming increasingly shallow. "Murphy, can you hear me?" Marcus asked, shining a small flashlight into the injured SEAL's eyes. Murphy's eyes opened slowly, but his pupils were dilated and unresponsive. He tried to speak, but only managed a weak whisper. "My chest can't breathe." Marcus checked the improvised chest tube he had inserted hours earlier. The device was functioning properly, but Murphy's lung was not reinflating as it should. Without proper surgical intervention, Murphy would likely not survive another few hours. The reality of their situation hit Marcus with devastating clarity. He was watching his teammates slowly die, while whoever had sent them on this mission sat safely in heated buildings, probably enjoying Christmas Eve dinner with their families. The anger that had been building inside him finally reached a boiling point. "That's it," Marcus said, standing up and reaching for his gear. "I'm going for help." Sullivan immediately tried to object. Rodriguez, you can't leave your position. That's a direct order. Marcus paused, looking down at his commanding officer. In any normal military situation, disobeying a direct order would be unthinkable. But these are not normal circumstances, and Marcus was beginning to understand that normal military protocols had already been abandoned by their own command structure. Sir, with respect, our command has already abandoned us. Murphy is dying, and he won't be the last one if we just sit here waiting for help that isn't coming. Someone needs to go for assistance, and I'm the only one who can walk. Sullivan stared at Marcus for a long moment, clearly wrestling with the decision. As a career military officer, every instinct told him to maintain chain of command and follow protocol. But as a leader responsible for the lives of his men, he could see that Marcus was right. Where will you go? Sullivan asked finally. Marcus had been thinking about this question for hours. There's a small village about 15 kilometers south of here. I saw it on the satellite images during our mission brief. It's not much, but they might have communication equipment or at least a way to get word to friendly forces. Petty Officer Chun, who had been listening to the conversation, spoke up weakly. That village is in disputed territory. Could be hostile. Everything around here is hostile, Marcus replied. But sitting here and waiting to freeze to death isn't going to help anyone. Marcus began gathering his equipment, taking only what he would need for the journey. He left most of their remaining medical supplies with Sullivan, along with detailed instructions for caring for each of the wounded men. As he prepared to leave, each of his teammates found ways to say goodbye despite their injuries. Thompson managed a weak smile and a thumbs up. Foster pressed a family photo into Marcus's hand, asking him to make sure his wife received it if he didn't make it back. Young Williams grabbed Marcus's arm with surprising strength. Please, he whispered, tell my girlfriend that I love her. Tell her I fought hard. Marcus promised each man that he would return with help, knowing that he might be making promises he could not keep. The journey to the village would be dangerous under the best of circumstances, and these were far from the best of circumstances. Before leaving the cave, Marcus made one final attempt to reach command on the radio. This time, instead of requesting extraction, he decided to try a different approach. Command, this is Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez with Alpha Team. I am officially notifying you that I am leaving my position to seek medical assistance for 11 wounded Navy SEALs who will die without immediate care. This action is being taken due to your failure to respond to our request for extraction over the past 8 hours. He paused, then continued with deliberate clarity. For the record, I'm not abandoning my post. I am fulfilling my oath to leave no man behind, since apparently that oath means nothing to whoever is listening to this transmission. The radio remained silent, but Marcus felt a grim satisfaction in knowing that his words were being recorded somewhere. If he died during his attempt to save his teammates, at least there would be some record of what had actually happened. Marcus stepped out of the cave into the howling wind and snow. The temperature had dropped to well below freezing, and visibility was limited to just a few meters. He pulled his winter gear tight around him and checked his compass bearing one more time. The terrain between the cave and the village was treacherous even in good weather. Rocky mountains, deep ravines, and loose scree made for difficult hiking. Add darkness, snow, and the constant threat of enemy patrols, and the journey became nearly suicidal. But Marcus had made his choice. He would rather die trying to save his teammates than sit in that cave watching them slowly succumb to their injuries. As he began the long trek through the mountains, he carried with him not just his own determination, but the hopes and prayers of 11 wounded warriors who were counting on him to bring back help. The wind cut through his clothing like icy knives, and the snow made each step treacherous. But Marcus pressed forward, driven by the memory of Murphy's labored breathing and Williams's plea to contact his girlfriend. Each step took him farther from the relative safety of the cave, but also brought him closer to potential salvation for his team. As he navigated the rocky terrain in the darkness, Marcus reflected on the oath he had taken when he joined the military. He had sworn to support and defend the Constitution, to bear true faith and allegiance, and to obey the orders of those appointed over him. But he had also sworn something more personal and more powerful, the informal oath shared by all special operations personnel to never leave a fallen comrade behind. Tonight, his command had abandoned that oath. They had written off 12 good men for reasons Marcus could not understand and might never learn. But Marcus would not abandon it. Even if it cost him his life, he would honor the promise that bound warriors together across all branches of service and all theaters of war. Behind him, in the cave, 11 wounded SEALs waited in the darkness, their lives hanging by threads that grew thinner with each passing hour. Ahead of him lay 15 kilometers of hostile territory, brutal weather, and unknown dangers. But Marcus Rodriguez had made his choice, and there was no turning back. The snow continued to fall as he disappeared into the night, carrying with him the last hope of 11 men who had served their country with honor, only to be abandoned by those they had trusted to bring them home. His journey through the mountains would test not only his physical endurance, but also his faith in the values he had spent his military career defending. Every step forward was an act of defiance against a system that had failed his teammates. Every breath in the freezing air was a declaration that some oaths were too sacred to be broken, even when those in authority had already broken them. Marcus Rodriguez walked alone through the Afghan mountains on Christmas Eve, carrying the weight of 11 lives on his shoulders and the unshakable conviction that a true warrior never abandons his brothers, no matter what the cost. The journey through the Afghan mountains tested every limit of Marcus Rodriguez's endurance. 3 hours into his trek, the storm had intensified to near-blizzard conditions. Snow whipped across his face with stinging force, and the wind howled through the rocky canyons with a sound like the voices of the dead. His GPS device had frozen solid an hour earlier, leaving him to navigate by compass and instinct through terrain that looked identical in every direction. Marcus's feet had lost most sensation 2 hours ago, and he could feel the early stages of frostbite beginning in his fingers despite his gloves. But he pressed forward, driven by the knowledge that 11 men were counting on him to bring back help. Every few minutes, he would stop and check his compass, making sure he maintained a southern bearing toward the village he hoped still existed. The physical challenges were only part of his struggle. As he climbed over loose rocks and through deep snow drifts, Marcus found himself wrestling with questions that had no easy answers. Why had their mission intelligence been so wrong? Who had given the order to cut off their communications? And, most importantly, how many other teams had been abandoned in similar circumstances? His radio crackled occasionally with distant transmissions in languages he didn't recognize, reminding him that he was walking through territory controlled by hostile forces. Several times, he thought he heard the sound of vehicles in the distance, forcing him to take cover among the rocks until the sounds faded away. As dawn approached, the snow finally began to ease, but the temperature continued to drop. Marcus could see his destination in the distance, a small cluster of buildings nestled in a valley between two mountain ridges. Smoke rose from several chimneys, indicating that the village was occupied and active. The sight of the village filled Marcus with both hope and anxiety. These people might be willing to help, but they could just as easily be sympathetic to the forces that had ambushed his team. Approaching the village would require careful planning and a significant amount of luck. Marcus found a position among the rocks overlooking the village and spent an hour observing the settlement through his binoculars. He counted roughly 30 buildings, most of them simple stone and mud brick structures typical of rural Afghanistan. There were signs of normal civilian activity: women carrying water, children playing in the snow, men tending to livestock. What he did not see were obvious signs of military presence or weapons emplacements. No armed guards, no military vehicles, and no communications equipment that he could identify. This gave him hope that the village might be neutral in the ongoing conflict. As Marcus prepared to approach the village, his radio suddenly came to life with a burst of clear communication. For a moment, his heart leaped with the possibility that command had finally decided to respond to their emergency. But as he listened to the transmission, his hope turned to horror. The voice was speaking in English with an American accent, but the words were not what Marcus had expected to hear. Cleanup Team Alpha confirmed that the target area has been sterilized. No survivors should remain from Operation Christmas Present. Marcus felt his blood turn to ice. Operation Christmas Present, that had been their mission code name. The transmission confirmed his worst fears. Not only had they been deliberately set up for the ambush, but now a cleanup team was being sent to make sure none of them survived to tell the story. A second voice responded to the first transmission. Negative on sterilization. We have thermal signatures indicating survivors in the target cave system. recommend immediate action to complete the objective. Marcus realized with growing terror that he had not only walked into a trap designed to kill his entire team, but that enemy forces were now actively hunting the wounded SEALs he had left behind. His decision to seek help had suddenly become a race against time to save his teammates from systematic execution. Without hesitation, Marcus abandoned his plan to seek help in the village and began retracing his steps toward the cave. But he knew that traveling the same route would take too long, and the cleanup team would reach his wounded teammates long before he could return to warn them. Studying his map quickly, Marcus identified a more direct route back to the cave that would involve crossing several exposed ridges where he would be visible to anyone with surveillance equipment. The route was dangerous and would leave him completely exposed, but it was the only way he might reach his team in time. As Marcus began his desperate race back through the mountains, he tried to process the magnitude of what he had discovered. Someone high up in the command structure had deliberately sacrificed 12 Navy SEALs to accomplish some larger objective. The ambush had not been a failure of intelligence. It had been the intended outcome. The questions that tormented Marcus as he climbed through the snow were even more disturbing than the physical challenges he faced. How many people were involved in the conspiracy? How high up did it go? And, most importantly, what could be so valuable that it was worth murdering an entire SEAL team to protect? His radio continued to intercept fragments of communications from the cleanup team. They were professional, efficient, and completely without mercy. These were not Afghan insurgents or Taliban fighters. These were highly trained military personnel who spoke English as their native language and used American military terminology. Marcus realized that his team had not just been abandoned. They had been betrayed by their own military. The cleanup team was composed of American soldiers who had been ordered to ensure that no witnesses survived to expose whatever operation had required the sacrifice of Alpha Team. The physical demands of his return journey were even more brutal than his initial trek toward the village. Running through deep snow at high altitude pushed his cardiovascular system to its limits, and the adrenaline that drove him forward could not completely overcome the effects of exhaustion and cold exposure. But Marcus pressed on, driven by images of his wounded teammates lying helpless in the cave, while professional killers moved through the mountains to eliminate them. Murphy, with his punctured lung and failing vital signs. Williams, so young and eager to prove himself. Sullivan, trying to maintain command despite his injuries. All of them trusting that someone would come to their aid. As Marcus climbed the final ridge before the valley that contained their cave, he could hear the sound of helicopter rotor blades in the distance. The cleanup team was arriving, and Marcus was still 20 minutes away from his teammates. He tried to reach them on the radio, knowing that any transmission would likely be intercepted by the cleanup team, but hoping to at least warn his teammates that hostile forces were approaching. Alpha Team, this is Rodriguez. Hostile forces inbound to your position, not friendly forces. Repeat, hostile American forces approaching your location. The response came not from his teammates, but from an unfamiliar voice with a cold, professional tone. Sergeant Rodriguez, this is Cleanup Team Alpha. Return to base immediately. Your team has been declared Kia, and your continued resistance is interfering with a classified operation. Marcus felt a surge of rage at the casual way the voice had declared his teammates dead. These men were not statistics to be written off in some classified report. They were warriors who had served their country with honor, and they deserved better than execution by their own military. Go to hell, Marcus responded into the radio. Those men are still alive, and I'm bringing them home. The voice on the radio became noticeably colder. Sergeant Rodriguez, you are now designated as a hostile target. Surrender immediately or face the consequences. Marcus switched off his radio and increased his pace. He was now officially considered an enemy by his own military, but that designation meant nothing compared to his loyalty to his wounded teammates. They were his family, his brothers in arms, and he would die before he let anyone harm them. As he approached the valley containing the cave, Marcus could see two military helicopters circling the area. These were not search and rescue aircraft. They were attack helicopters armed with missiles and heavy machine guns. The cleanup team was not planning to take prisoners. Marcus reached into his pack and pulled out the one piece of equipment he had hoped he would never need to use against American forces, a shoulder-fired anti-aircraft missile that every SEAL team carried for emergency situations. The irony was not lost on him that he was about to use American weapons against American helicopters to protect American soldiers from American betrayal. He found a position among the rocks that provided both cover and a clear line of sight to the helicopters. As he prepared the missile system, Marcus said a silent prayer for his teammates and for himself. Win or lose, his military career was over. He had chosen to fight against his own command structure to protect his brothers, and there would be no going back from that decision. The lead helicopter was moving into position to fire on the cave entrance when Marcus pulled the trigger. The missile streaked across the valley with a trail of white smoke, striking the aircraft in its main rotor assembly. The helicopter spun out of control and crashed into the mountainside in a ball of fire and smoke. The second helicopter immediately turned toward Marcus's position, its pilot undoubtedly radiating his coordinates to ground forces. Marcus abandoned his position and began moving through the rocks, using every bit of terrain to stay hidden from the aircraft's sophisticated surveillance equipment. He was no longer just trying to save his teammates. He was now fighting a war against his own military, and the odds were becoming increasingly desperate with each passing moment. The explosion from the crashed helicopter lit up the pre-dawn sky like a deadly sunrise. Marcus Rodriguez crouched among the rocks, watching the second aircraft circle warily as its crew tried to locate his position. The pilot was being more cautious now, having seen his wingman destroyed by what should have been a helpless target. Marcus knew that shooting down the helicopter had bought him time, but it had also escalated the situation beyond any hope of peaceful resolution. He was now officially at war with his own military, and reinforcements would be arriving soon. His only chance was to reach his teammates before the ground forces could surround the cave. The remaining helicopter was equipped with thermal imaging systems that could detect his body heat, even through the rocky terrain. Marcus needed to create confusion and misdirection if he hoped to reach the cave undetected. He pulled out 2 emergency flares from his pack and lit them simultaneously, throwing them in opposite directions to create multiple heat signatures. While the helicopter pilot was trying to determine which thermal signature was the real target, Marcus sprinted across the exposed ground toward the cave entrance. He could hear rifle fire behind him as ground troops attempted to hit him from long range, but the distance and his erratic movement pattern made accurate shooting nearly impossible. Marcus dove through the cave entrance just as the helicopter opened fire with its machine guns, sending bullets ricocheting off the rocks where he had been moments before. Inside the cave, he found his wounded teammates in worse condition than when he had left them. Murphy was unconscious and barely breathing, while several others showed signs of advanced hypothermia. "Rodriguez," Lieutenant Commander Sullivan called out weakly. "Thank God you made it back. Did you find help?" Marcus quickly explained what he had discovered during his journey: the intercepted radio transmissions, the cleanup team, and the deliberate nature of their abandonment. The wounded SEALs listened in stunned silence as the full scope of their betrayal became clear. "So we're not getting rescued," Petty Officer Chin said quietly. "They want us dead. They want us dead, but they're going to have to work for it," Marcus replied grimly. He began distributing ammunition and weapons to those who were still capable of fighting. "We're going to make our own extraction." Sullivan struggled to sit up straighter despite his injuries. "Rodriguez, there's something you need to know. While you were gone, Foster managed to tap into some encrypted communications. We're not the first team this has happened to." Foster nodded weakly from his position against the cave wall. "I intercepted fragments of communications about previous operations. Operation Thanksgiving, Operation Independence Day, Operation New Year. They've been systematically eliminating SEAL teams for months." The implications hit Marcus like a physical blow. This was not an isolated incident of military betrayal. It was part of a larger conspiracy to eliminate witnesses to some massive cover-up. How many good soldiers had died believing they were serving their country when they were actually being murdered by it? "Do we know why?" Marcus asked. Sullivan shook his head. The communications were too fragmented to understand the full picture. But it involves something called Project Lazarus, and it's big enough that they're willing to kill dozens of special operations personnel to keep it secret. Marcus absorbed this information while checking the defensive positions around the cave entrance. The cleanup team would be moving in soon, and his wounded teammates were in no condition for a prolonged firefight. They needed a miracle, and Marcus was fresh out of miracles. The sound of approaching vehicles echoed through the valley as the cleanup team's ground forces moved into position. Marcus counted at least 3 engines, which meant they were facing a minimum of 12 to 15 heavily armed soldiers in addition to the helicopter that continued to circle overhead. "How many rounds do we have?" Marcus asked, taking inventory of their ammunition supplies. The count was depressing. Between all the wounded men who could still fight, they had perhaps 200 rounds of rifle ammunition and a handful of grenades. Against professional soldiers with unlimited resupply capabilities, their ammunition would last perhaps 10 minutes in a sustained firefight. But Marcus was not planning a sustained firefight. He was planning something that went against every principle of military tactics he had ever learned, but which might be their only chance of survival. "Listen up," Marcus said to the men who were still conscious. "I'm going out there to negotiate." Sullivan immediately objected. "Rodriguez, they're not here to negotiate. They're here to kill us all." "Maybe," Marcus replied, "but they're also here to contain a security breach. If I can convince them that killing us will create a bigger problem than letting us live, they might reconsider their orders." It was a desperate gamble based on Marcus's understanding of military bureaucracy. The cleanup team had been sent to eliminate witnesses, but they had also been sent to keep the operation quiet. If Marcus could threaten to expose the conspiracy in a way that would guarantee maximum publicity, the cleanup team might decide that negotiation was preferable to a firefight that could attract unwanted attention. Marcus gathered every piece of recording equipment the team possessed: cameras, audio recorders, and data storage devices. He quickly recorded testimonies from each of his wounded teammates, documenting their names, service records, and statements about their abandonment and betrayal. "If something happens to me," Marcus told Sullivan, "make sure these recordings get to someone who can use them. The media, Congress, anyone who can bring this to light." Marcus then did something that violated every security protocol he had ever learned. He activated the team's emergency beacon and began transmitting on every available frequency, including civilian emergency channels and international monitoring stations. "This is Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez, United States Army, serial number 123-45-60789. I am broadcasting from coordinates 34.2785 north, 70.1473 east in Afghanistan. My team has been abandoned by our command and is currently under attack by American forces attempting to eliminate witnesses to classified crimes." Marcus continued his transmission, providing detailed information about their mission, their abandonment, and the cleanup operation currently underway. He knew that multiple intelligence agencies, foreign governments, and monitoring stations would be recording his words, creating a permanent record that could not be covered up or denied. The response was immediate. His radio exploded with communications from various sources. American command posts demanding that he cease transmitting, foreign intelligence services requesting clarification, and what sounded like news organizations trying to confirm the information. But the most important response came from the cleanup team itself. A voice that Marcus recognized from earlier transmissions came through on their tactical frequency. "Sergeant Rodriguez, this is Colonel James Patterson, United States Special Operations Command. I am ordering you to cease all transmissions immediately and surrender your position." Marcus had never heard of Colonel Patterson, but the man's voice carried the authority of someone accustomed to being obeyed without question. More importantly, the fact that he had identified himself by name and rank suggested that the situation had become too public for anonymous cleanup operations. "Colonel Patterson," Marcus responded, "I am prepared to discuss terms for the safe evacuation of my wounded teammates. But first, I want to know why American soldiers are trying to kill American soldiers on Christmas morning." There was a long pause before Patterson responded. "Sergeant, you have stumbled into matters that are classified far above your security clearance. What you consider abandonment was actually a necessary sacrifice for national security." Necessary sacrifice? Marcus felt his anger rising. "These are Navy SEALs, Colonel. They've served their country with honor for years. What national security interest is worth murdering 11 wounded warriors?" Another pause, then Patterson's voice came back more carefully measured. "Sergeant, I'm going to explain something to you that I probably shouldn't. Your team was sent to eliminate a target who possessed information that could destabilize American foreign policy for decades. That target was eliminated, but your team was compromised in the process. Allowing you to return and be debriefed would have exposed operations that protect millions of American lives. Marcus processed this information, trying to understand the logic that would justify murdering an entire SEAL team. So you decided to kill us instead of trusting us to keep classified information classified. The information your team was exposed to goes beyond normal classification levels, Patterson replied. It involves ongoing operations that, if exposed, would result in the deaths of thousands of American personnel worldwide and the collapse of strategic alliances that have taken decades to build. Marcus looked around the cave at his wounded teammates, all of whom were listening intently to this conversation. These were men who had spent their entire military careers handling the most sensitive operations and classified information imaginable. The suggestion that they could not be trusted with whatever they had supposedly learned was both insulting and implausible. "Colonel," Marcus said finally, "I don't care what we supposedly learned or saw. These men deserve medical treatment and the chance to go home to their families. We can discuss security concerns after we get them to a hospital." Patterson's response was immediate and final. "That is not possible, Sergeant. The security risk is too great. I'm offering you one final opportunity to surrender. We can make your deaths quick and painless, and your families will be told that you died heroically in combat." Marcus felt a cold fury settle over him as he realized that Patterson was offering them the privilege of being murdered quietly rather than fighting for their lives. The colonel's casual mention of lying to their families added insult to the ultimate injury. "Colonel Patterson," Marcus said into the radio, his voice carrying a deadly calm, "you can go straight to hell. These men are going home, even if I have to fight every soldier in the United States Army to make it happen." Patterson's final transmission was equally cold. "Then, you have chosen how this ends, Sergeant. God help you all." The radio went silent, and Marcus could hear vehicles moving closer to the cave entrance. The negotiation phase was over, and the battle for their lives was about to begin. The first assault came at dawn on Christmas morning. Marcus Rodriguez positioned himself at the cave entrance, using the natural rock formations as cover while the cleanup team advanced up the mountain slope. Behind him, his wounded teammates prepared for what they all knew might be their final battle. Lieutenant Commander Sullivan, despite his injuries, had managed to prop himself up with his rifle and was covering the right flank of the cave entrance. Petty Officer Chun, though weakened by blood loss, had taken position on the left side. The other wounded SEALs who could still hold weapons were spread throughout the cave in whatever defensive positions they could manage. Marcus had spent the pre-dawn hours rigging explosive charges at strategic points around the cave entrance using their remaining demolition supplies. If the cleanup team wanted to eliminate them, they would have to pay a heavy price for the privilege. The cleanup team approached with professional precision, using suppressive fire and coordinated movement that spoke of extensive training and experience. These were not regular infantry soldiers. They were special operations personnel who had been specifically chosen for this mission. Marcus waited until the assault team was committed to their approach before triggering the first explosive charge. The detonation brought down a section of the rocky slope, creating an avalanche that swept away 3 attackers and temporarily disrupted their advance. "First blood to us," Marcus called back to his teammates, trying to maintain morale despite their desperate circumstances. The cleanup team regrouped quickly, using their helicopter to provide covering fire while they established new positions around the cave. Marcus could see that they were setting up for a siege rather than another direct assault. They had time on their side and unlimited resources, while the wounded SEALs had limited ammunition and no hope of resupply. But Marcus had one advantage that the cleanup team did not fully appreciate. His earlier transmission had been intercepted by multiple parties, and the situation was rapidly becoming an international incident. His radio crackled with communications from news organizations, foreign intelligence services, and what sounded like American politicians demanding explanations. Colonel Patterson came back on the tactical frequency with a new offer. "Sergeant Rodriguez, the situation has become complicated. We are prepared to offer you and your men medical evacuation and complete pardons in exchange for your silence about this operation." Marcus almost laughed at the audacity of the offer. "Colonel, you've been trying to murder us for the past 12 hours. Why should we trust you now? Because the alternative is that you all die here, and your families never learn the truth about what happened to you," Patterson replied coldly. Marcus looked back at his wounded teammates, all of whom were listening to the exchange. These men had been betrayed by their own command, hunted like animals, and offered the choice between death and complicity in covering up their own attempted murder. Petty Officer Williams, the youngest member of the team, spoke up weakly from his position near the back of the cave. Rodriguez, what do you think? Can we trust them? Marcus considered the question carefully. From a tactical standpoint, accepting the offer might save their lives in the short term. But from a moral standpoint, accepting would mean becoming part of the conspiracy that had already murdered an unknown number of American soldiers. I think, Marcus said slowly, that once you start murdering American soldiers to protect classified operations, you've crossed a line that you can't uncross. If they're willing to kill us once, they'll be willing to kill us again whenever we become inconvenient. Sullivan nodded from his position by the cave entrance. Rodriguez is right. These people have already proven they can't be trusted. Our only chance is to fight our way out or make enough noise that they can't afford to kill us quietly. Marcus made his decision. He activated his emergency transmitter again and began broadcasting on all frequencies. This is Staff Sergeant Marcus Rodriguez, United States Army. I am currently under assault by American military forces who are attempting to eliminate witnesses to classified crimes. If anyone is monitoring this transmission, please relay this information to the news media and to Congress. The response was immediate and overwhelming. Marcus's radio was flooded with communications from various sources, all demanding more information about the situation. Foreign intelligence services were recording everything. News organizations were scrambling to verify the story, and what sounded like American government officials were frantically trying to understand what was happening. But the most important response came from an unexpected source, a voice that identified itself as Senator Margaret Thompson, chairman of the Senate Intelligence Committee. Sergeant Rodriguez, this is Senator Thompson. I am currently in emergency session with congressional leadership regarding your situation. Can you confirm that American military forces are attempting to kill American soldiers? Marcus felt a surge of hope. Senator Thompson was one of the most respected members of Congress and had a reputation for fearlessly investigating military and intelligence abuses. If she was personally involved in the situation, it might mean that help was finally coming. Senator Thompson, that is confirmed. My team has been abandoned and is currently under assault by forces identifying themselves as a cleanup operation. They have attempted to eliminate us to prevent testimony about classified operations. Sergeant, Senator Thompson replied, I want you to know that this situation now has the attention of the highest levels of government. Can you maintain your position until we can sort this out? Marcus looked around the cave at his wounded teammates. Murphy was unconscious and barely breathing. Several others were showing signs of advanced hypothermia and blood loss. They could hold their position for a while longer, but not indefinitely. Senator, we have multiple wounded personnel who need immediate medical attention. We can hold our position, but time is critical. Understood, Sergeant. Help is on the way. Colonel Patterson's voice cut into the transmission, clearly agitated. Senator Thompson, this is a classified military operation. Congressional oversight does not extend to active combat situations. Senator Thompson's response was sharp and immediate. Colonel Patterson, congressional oversight extends to wherever I say it extends. You will cease all hostile actions immediately and withdraw your forces pending a full investigation. I cannot do that, Senator. The security implications... Colonel, Senator Thompson interrupted, I am ordering you to stand down. Any further action against those soldiers will be considered a violation of direct congressional oversight and will result in immediate criminal prosecution. Marcus could hear heated discussions among the cleanup team members as they tried to process these new orders. The situation had escalated beyond their original mission parameters, and they were clearly uncertain about how to proceed. But Marcus knew that the danger was not over. The conspiracy that had ordered their elimination involved people with enough power to sacrifice multiple SEAL teams. Senator Thompson's intervention might save them temporarily, but it would not eliminate the threat permanently. As if reading his thoughts, Patterson came back on the radio with a new tone in his voice. Sergeant Rodriguez, you need to understand that exposing this operation will have consequences far beyond your immediate situation. American lives around the world depend on the secrecy of certain operations. Marcus felt his anger flare again. Colonel, American lives in this cave depend on not being murdered by their own military. Whatever operation you're protecting, it's not worth more than the lives of the men who serve this country with honor. You don't understand the bigger picture. Patterson insisted. The target your team eliminated was planning to expose American intelligence operations that protect thousands of our personnel worldwide. His death was necessary, but he managed to pass information to your team before he died. Marcus finally began to understand the scope of what they had stumbled into. Their target had not just been a terrorist leader. He had been someone with detailed knowledge of American intelligence operations. And somehow, information had been passed to their team that made them witnesses to activities that powerful people wanted kept secret. What kind of information? Marcus asked. Patterson hesitated before answering. Information about American operations in allied countries that violate international law. Information about political assassinations, illegal weapons transfers, and covert operations that could destroy decades of diplomatic relationships if exposed. Marcus processed this information while maintaining his defensive position. If their target had possessed evidence of American war crimes or illegal operations, then their elimination made sense from the perspective of protecting those operations. But it did not make it right. Colonel, Marcus said finally, I don't care what we supposedly learned. We took an oath to defend the Constitution, not to cover up crimes committed by our own government. Sometimes protecting the Constitution requires making difficult choices, Patterson replied. No, Marcus said firmly. Protecting the Constitution requires following the law and holding our government accountable for its actions. What you're doing is the opposite of protecting the Constitution. Senator Thompson's voice cut through the argument. Colonel Patterson, this philosophical discussion can continue later. I am ordering immediate medical evacuation for those wounded soldiers and full protection for all witnesses pending congressional investigation. Marcus could hear helicopters approaching, but these sounded different from the attack aircraft that had been circling earlier. Through the cave entrance, he could see aircraft with medical markings and congressional oversight identifications. But as the rescue helicopters approached, Patterson made one final transmission that chilled Marcus to the bone. Senator Thompson, you should know that this operation goes much higher than my pay grade. Saving these soldiers may just postpone their deaths, not prevent them. Marcus realized that even congressional intervention might not be enough to protect them permanently. The conspiracy they had uncovered involved people with the power to eliminate senators as well as soldiers if necessary. As medical personnel rushed into the cave to treat his wounded teammates, Marcus made a silent vow. He would not just survive this ordeal. He would expose the entire conspiracy, no matter how high it went or how powerful the people involved might be. The wounded SEALs were carefully loaded onto medical helicopters as Senator Thompson's security team secured the area. Marcus rode with the most critically injured, watching as doctors and medics worked frantically to save lives that had been hanging by threads for too many hours. As their helicopter lifted off from the Afghan mountains, Marcus looked down at the cave that had sheltered them through their darkest hour. They had survived, but their fight was far from over. Somewhere in the American government, powerful people were planning their next move to protect secrets that were apparently worth murdering American soldiers to preserve. Marcus Rodriguez had refused to abandon his teammates, and now he would refuse to abandon his mission to expose the truth. The 11 SEALs he had saved would recover from their physical wounds, but the wounds inflicted by their own government would take much longer to heal. The war for their lives was over, but the war for justice was just beginning.